Hi everyone. My name is Jacob Harris. I'm one of the 5 members of the symposium organizing committee. The others are here with us, Upasana, Rivki, Zoe, and Zachary Hope. I'm a humanities teaching fellow here in English, in English here at U Chicago, where I completed my PhD last summer. My own research focuses on intellectual exchanges between Indian and British writers in the early 20th century. As this is our first roundtable event, I'd just like to give a few very brief welcome remarks today in lieu of an in-person welcome address before turning things over to Chris Taylor and our 4 roundtable presenters. But before I do this, I'd just like to thank you all for your patience with the tech issues surrounding panel B earlier this afternoon. We faced some small issues with our webinar licensing at the beginning of the day, but we do expect to have this fixed in time for tomorrow's panels. And so we'll be sure to update you all with links for the new B panel Zoom room. We're hugely grateful as well to the panelists from Idioms of Resistance who were still able to come through and share 3 fascinating presentations in today's makeshift seminar room. So without further ado, welcome to Spectacles of Decline, an interdisciplinary and international symposium convened virtually here at the University of Chicago and in our living rooms, right? Spectacles of Decline addresses the aesthetics of imperial decline in the former British Empire, develops in the nexus between cultural production, nationalist exhibition, and public spectacle. Focused on what we like to call the slow burn of British imperial decline, our event focuses on the long final century and a half of the British Empire, from the emergent internal tensions of the mid-19th century to post-war decolonization. The original idea behind the symposium emerged in response to the twofold context of Brexit, with its underlying current of a nostalgic British nationalism that clings to fantasies of empire, and the reassertion of longstanding narratives of Western cultural decay and far-right rhetorics across Britain, Europe, and North America. Such narratives of cultural and civic decay shape the discursive life of what Jed Esty calls declinism. His term in the paper that the book chapter that he circulated in advance of his workshop, his term for the rhetoric of lost national greatness at the center of contemporary reactions to waning hegemony in the US and in Britain. Our event is similarly animated by the tensions and contradictions of declinism in its renewed prominence in European and American life. But of course, we are also oriented towards other modes in which the end of empire can be imagined, discussed, and anticipated, especially in anti-imperial and decolonial discourses. Put in broad terms, today's roundtable, the first keynote event of our symposium, addresses the intersections between British imperial power and knowledge production. This roundtable is interested in what we call the blockages, breakdowns, and strategic redeployments of knowledge, and its uses as knowledge is embedded, contested, and counteracted within specific scenes of decolonial practice. So today we'll hear brief presentations from Professors Peter Kalliney, James Hevia, Nasser Mufti, and Tariq Jazeel before opening up the room for conversation. And the way we want this to work is to use the raise hand function here, and Chris will verbally nominate you, and then I'll enable you to speak. So we'll do it that way, but you probably won't be able to show your video if you're asking a question. But with all of that said, I'm going to leave things over to Chris. So thank you all for coming, and welcome to the first keynote event of our symposium.
All right, thanks, Jacob. So I'm just going to do brief introductions, and then we're going to hand it off basically to Peter. I believe you're going first. Peter Kalliney comes to us from the University of Kentucky, where he's the William J. Tuggle Chair in English, with appointments also in social theory and African American studies. Peter's currently working on a book project entitled Bandung Generation, Decolonization, and the Aesthetic Cold War. His previous works include Modernism in a Global Context and Commonwealth of Letters, British Literary Culture, and the Emergence of Postcolonial Aesthetics. Next in the lineup is James Hevia, who's a professor emeritus of history at the University of Chicago. James is completing a sequence of really incredible books that begins with the imperial security state, British colonial knowledge, and empire building in Asia, and then followed by animal labor and colonial warfare. And the 3rd volume, I believe, is called Imperial Pests, which is just an incredible title. 3rd, we have Nasser Mufti, who is the associate head and an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Nasser is the author of Civilizing War, Imperial Politics, and the Poetics of National Rupture. And he's currently looking into the relationship between Pan-Africanism and 19th century British culture, and a lot of C.L.R. James in there also. And finally, we have Tariq Jazeel, who's professor of geography at the University College London. Tariq's publications include Sacred Modernity, Nature, Environment, and the Postcolonial Geographies of Sri Lankan Nationhood. He edits a bunch of things, including the volume Subaltern Geographies. So we've got some presentations to go through, and then we'll open it up for a conversation and take some questions from the audience. Peter, can you go first for us?
I am. I'm just going to share my screen here. Give me the quick thumbs up if you can see it. Good. Okay, so my brief opening remarks today will focus on Doris Lessing. But before I say anything, I want to thank the organizers, Jacob, Zach, Upasana, Rivki, and Zoe for inviting me to participate in this. And Chris, thank you for directing traffic today. So my goal in this project is to think about how cultural institutions and networks related to the Cold War influenced the literature of decolonization. And in the first half of the project, I study how the US and the Soviet Union developed competing cultural diplomacy programs using international conferences, art centers, publication schemes, and literary magazines to establish relationships with intellectuals in the decolonizing world. In the second part of the project, from which my remarks today are going to be drawn, I examine how large states use censorship, surveillance, incarceration, and deportation to intimidate or contain writers they could not otherwise control. And I know that one of our panelists has got some interest in C.L.R. James, and he features prominently in that section of the project. My overarching argument is that the literature emerging from Africa and Asia during the middle decades of the 20th century was impacted more by the Cold War than by the decolonization struggle in certain respects. We'll talk about Lessing today. Lessing spent her formative years in what was then Rhodesia, leaving for London in 1949 when she was 30 years old. She was the object of MI5 surveillance for about a decade and a half from the late 1940s through the early 1960s. Secret police tapped her phones, watched her home, logged her guests, tracked her movements, peeped in her diaries, and took notes on everything that she was writing and publishing. She was watched especially closely when she made a trip to Rhodesia in 1956 to 57, which she writes about in a book called Going Home. And she talks about how exasperating it is to be trailed all over the vast Rhodesian countryside by the police. And then when she tried to enter South Africa, to be denied entry altogether. The most important thing to note about this surveillance network was that there was nothing covert about it. We think of these as the political police or the secret police, but they made it very clear to Lessing that she was being watched, and she knew that she was being watched, and they knew that she was being watched. So there's nothing at all secret about this. Now, knowing this, what's most surprising about Lessing's career is that she did not turn to the paranoid style. Instead, I'm going to suggest that Lessing's brushes with the political police can help us understand how she developed as a writer, transitioning away from the very realist style of her early work, and then further away from the experimental fiction she shows in her best-known novel, The Golden Notebook, published in 1962, and moving increasingly towards speculative, or what she called space fiction, in the 1970s. A quick turn to the fifth and final volume of the Children of Violence series called The Four-Gated City in 1969 may illustrate what I have in mind. The first 4.5 volumes of these stories provide a fairly conventional Bildungsroman, but suddenly about midway through the final volume, it veers off track when Martha Quest, the protagonist, starts to hear voices in her head. Confused and then alarmed when she realizes what's happening, she at first tries to resist the urge to use this new telepathic power. Good heavens, it wasn't far off eavesdropping, she remarks. But gradually she starts to hone these skills, embracing her new powers of intelligent perception. Now, the main narrative ends in about 1969, right when the novel is first published. The concluding sections of the novel are constructed out of a series of enigmatic appendices, some written from roughly 30 years in the future, that is the year 2000. Around 1970, we learn things become overly authoritarian in metropolitan Britain, turning into a vast interlocking system of spies and counter-spies. Against the political police, a scattered band of hippie-like dropouts, including Martha, begin to imagine, quote, the possible dent in this structure made by a group of people with ordinary telepathic powers. So ordinary people start to assume within their own consciousness the technologies of the political police, and this is how they're going to fight back. Realizing that, quote, a significant proportion of the population had various kinds of extrasensory powers, not as a theoretical possibility, but as a fact, leads Martha to conclude that human beings were growing powers, which could make all of this machinery useless, out of date, obsolete, end quote. To put this very crudely, Lessing's turn to speculative fiction did not emerge out of a straightforward protest against intelligence gathering, but rather from a belief that ordinary human beings could evolve sensory powers. Only better, more efficient network of intelligence wielded by ordinary people can outmaneuver the political police in her narrative. Now, at some point during the 1970s, there's a nuclear holocaust in this novel, sending the functionaries of the old national governments to underground bunkers to wait out the nuclear winter. Nonconformist groups, such as Martha's, meanwhile, find relatively habitable zones where they can reconstruct a simple life of hunting and gathering. They have intermittent telepathic contact with other scattered settlements across the globe. In Martha's community, none of the children born since the nuclear disaster have developed any physical deformities. Most of them have second sight or second hearing, and occasionally both. In her group, the 7 children with both sight and hearing, and this is from the passage here, are revered by the community. Well, what distinguishes them from the others, those with only one type of ESP or no ESP? There's nothing you can measure or count, but we all feel it, and particularly the other children. For one thing, they're grown up. No, not physically, of course, but mentally, emotionally. One talks to them as if they were adult. No, not quite that. One talks to them as if they are superior to us, which they are. It is as if, can I put it like this? They're beings who include the history of humankind in themselves and who have transcended it. They include a comprehension we can't begin to imagine. These 7 children are, but we have no word for it. The nearest to it is that they are our guardians. They guard us, end quote. These children, physically fit and healthy by all observable measures, have begun a new chapter in evolutionary history, charting a new path of development. Development of the material or economic world along capitalist or communist lines in the Cold War context has led to nuclear disaster. Development in the 4 gated cities post-apocalyptic world will be psychic and evolutionary, including an enlargement of the sensory organs. These superhuman children, of course, have brought the powers of the surveillance network, reading thoughts, understanding feelings, forecasting events into the fold of consciousness itself. Martha describes them as guardians of this community, superior to the old version of humans in every way that matters. They guard and watch and forecast without government backing, military budgets, or technological gadgets. They're ultimate spies. So if the concluding sections of the 4 gated city help us see connections between different aspects of Doris Lessing's career as she shuttled between realist Bildungsroman, the novel of ideas, and speculative or science fiction, the novel also gives us tools for understanding how the aesthetic disagreements of the Cold War were being reformulated by anti-colonial writers. Politically progressive futures imagined by mid-century writers were not always and not only determined by the material and social limits of the world as it existed. Thinking beyond the polarities of the Cold War could involve a kind of generic impulsiveness and restlessness that pressured the forms fiction might take. Lessing's fiction increasingly discards the convention of representing consciousness found in both socialist writing and in experimental high modernism. She takes this process a step further in Canopus in Argus, her next fictional series, if any of you read it. It's totally wacky. So for instance, in the first installment, Shikasta, the basic narrative of the Children of Violence series becomes only one brief semi-chapter of an intergalactic race to colonize the planets. Observed from the perspective of a more advanced alien species, major events of the 20th century, such as decolonization and the Cold War, become short but very minor narrative digressions in a story of immense duration and interplanetary scope. What surprises most, I think, is her reliance on the intelligence network as her model of how consciousness or sentience will evolve. In contrast to 1984, Orwell's well-known novel, which regards state surveillance as the ultimate tool of repression and control, The Four-Gated City concludes that only by mimicking the powers of the political police will ordinary humans reclaim some measure of independence and freedom. Lessing proposes to decolonize the mind, to borrow Ngugi wa Thiong'o's apt phrase, rather literally, through acts of evolutionary development that cannot be anticipated or controlled by large states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. James, we'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris. And the organizers, I want to thank them also for this invitation. I'm no longer living in Chicago. I'm now located in Maryland, and I am trying to get used to doing whatever I want to do all day, which is different from what had gone on the 30 years before. At any rate, just a few thoughts. The description of this panel notes that the British Empire was also an information network, one that was unevenly distributed across the space of empire, resulting in blockages, breakdowns, and strategic redeployments of knowledge. One support for such claims lies in native resistance to the epistemological practices that informed knowledge production. There was and continued to be indigenous pushback ranging from open rebellion to subtle acts of non-compliance that caused what some administrators and military men termed frictions within the colonial order, obstacles which could frequently be located causally as a product of the racial shortcomings of their colonial subjects. Indigenous resistance and qualified compliance were not the only causes of turbulence within the colonial order, however. It might also be argued that these blockages, breakdowns, and strategic redeployments were embedded in the epistemological practices themselves. Practices that sought to produce a useful or instrumental form of knowledge, knowledge that could be expeditiously and economically applied. Things like surveying and measuring land, enumerating populations and classifying racial types were considered sound methods to organize the landscape for the purpose of taxation and agricultural development, and for the purpose of controlling unruly others inside the colonies and on the borders of colonies. The methods suffered, however, by, for example, conveniently ignoring a sense by conveniently ignoring a good deal of history, the mobility of groups, the fluidity of native practices, and an indigenous sense of rights and obligations concerning access to commons or to common land. In the latter case, the commons might be what the British termed wasteland, about which little positive knowledge could be produced. For the colonized, that same land played an important role in communal practices and as sources of scarce resources. In the end, the many limitations of the epistemological regime produced not only an enormous amount of contradictory paperwork, much of which still exists in the imperial archives of post-colonial nation states, but the regime also caused more than a few disasters. Now, I've talked about these kinds of disasters of the well thought out rational project in a couple of my books. One example that I found the most fascinating was the re-engineering of the Indus River through massive canal projects, which resulted in waterlogging areas, high levels of soil salinization, and created breeding grounds for insects carrying malaria and trypanosomiasis. Literally, in other words, the blockages and breakdowns we allude to. More importantly, perhaps, the epistemological practices, based as they were on science and rationality, made it difficult for the imperial government to openly question those practices. Instead, we read reports on canal-related issues that waterlogging and salinization were alleged shortcomings of an otherwise unique engineering marvel, itself a gift of empire. As for the wasteland, it remained not only economically valueless, it was cross-cut with the most fantastical beliefs of the benighted subjects of empire. Specters of all sorts roamed in it: demons, haunted ruins, magical waters, healing sites of Sufi saints. The wasteland was the space of a rational native superstition in which no amount of education or institutions of rational scientific planning could alter. Cataloging native superstitions became another form of imperial knowledge production. It helped to explain to the British why natives could be duped into acting against their own best interests when they followed mad mullahs, fanatical fakirs, or witch doctors. Fanatics, in fact, haunted the imperial archive, offering rich imagery exploited in tales of vast conspiracies that threaten the very foundations of empire. And here I think about many of those fantastical characters like Fu Manchu and others who not only threatened the colonies, but threatened to bring subversive forces into the imperial center itself. For the last 3 decades, I've been studying the British Imperial Archive and following one of my mentors, Bernard Cohen, exploring its forms of colonial knowledge. Cohen encourages students to focus attention on the material forms in which knowledge was produced, classified, stored, and circulated. I've done this through studies of how China was made into a legible object in the strategic planning for the security of the British, Asian, and African empire. I've looked at how knowledge produced in one part of empire influenced other parts, and how one or another form of useful knowledge could be refigured into grand schemes for the defense of empire or its dissolution. One thing I think I can say from all this research is that declining decolonization looks different. Political independence did not necessarily mean freedom from the forms of knowledge the British produced or from the military and administrative structures that they handed over to the new nation states. In fact, in many cases, their forms continue to be produced today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, James. Nasser, Associate Head, it's up to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for being here. It's strange to not be able to see you. So who in the world could look at, sorry, wait, now it's not letting me change slides. There we go. Oh, answer was given. Who in the world look at this building, Le Corbusier's Palace of Justice in Chandigarh, and see the British Raj of the 19th century? who could look at one of the most famous examples of tropical modernism, the singular architectural achievement of Nehru's India, a building synonymous with the architecture of independence, specifically post-colonial independence, and see nothing but the clubs of Rudyard Kipling's fiction. It's this guy. In an area of darkness, his first travelogue to his ancestral home, Naipaul describes Corbusier's Chandigarh as a continuation of the architecture of the Raj. He says, they are both the work of people consciously seeking to express ideas of themselves. Such ideas, he goes on to explain, are ahistorical and acontextual. So he goes on, he says, their grounds were a little too spacious, their ceilings a little too high, their columns and arches and pediments a little too rhetorical. They were neither of England nor India. They were a little too grand for their purpose, too grand for the puniness, poverty, and defeat in which they were set. They were appropriate to a conception of endeavor rather than to endeavor. The size of the grounds and their relation to the buildings, the scale of the interior spaces, the embellishments of the architectural features, and the contrast between the buildings and their settings all speak in the alphabet of the Raj architecture, a lexicon designed to appear foreign to the Indian landscape and one that is inherited by the architecture of independence. So the Palace of Justice in Chandigarh might lack Saracenic design, towers with accompanying spires, onion domes, oversized parapets, but Corbusier reproduces fantasies of the colonial epoch by conveying an idea of Indian post-colonial nationhood in his design. So even though the vast honeycombed monoliths of Chandigarh could not be further from the spaciousness, grandness, rhetoricalness of, let's say, Calcutta's Victoria Memorial, something like the Palace of Justice or the High Court, its commitment to an idea of India, to the fantasy of nationhood, means that for Naipaul, it remains mired in the 19th century aesthetic of empire. And this is not so much because of the failures of architectural modernism to like break free from the past or something, but it's because of the nature of national culture as such, he'll go on to kind of argue. His travelogue has this kind of fantastic chapter towards the end, which is just a kind of lengthy analysis of British literary culture, but also culture in general in the 19th century. There he observes that Britishness in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice connotes geography and describes a physical place. But in E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, Britishness, he says, is a formulated ideal. It needs no elucidation. The word British can almost be spelt with a small b. He'll continue, and he says, between the two uses of the word lie 100 years of industrial and imperial power. And so using these two bookends of Pride and Prejudice and A Passage to India, Naipaul then reconstructs a history of British national identity from the standpoint of this kind of regime of fantasy that he sees everywhere in India. That is to say, he reconstructs a history of the idea of British national identity in the 19th century, not British national identity as such. The arc of this history from Austen to Forster maps onto a kind of shift between a kind of national Bildung to national stasis. From the turn of the 19th century onwards, he says, and this is kind of mostly just quotes from him, we can sense the swiftness of change from stagecoach to railway, from the essays of Hazlitt to those of Macaulay, from the Pickwick Papers to Our Mutual Friend. It is a period of newness and self-discovery. Dickens discovering England, London discovering the novel, newness even in Keats and Shelley. Naipaul goes on to highlight the development of a range of national institutions, from the novel, mostly Dickens, to national historiography, Macaulay, poetry, Keats and Shelley, to painting, John Constable and Richard Parkes Bonington, each of which for him exemplified England's youth and during this period of vigor and expectation. This was a culture, he goes on to say, of a city, this was a culture of city people who live and die without roots suspended. But at a time we cannot precisely fix, occurred that break in English sensibility as radical and as seemingly abrupt as that which we have witnessed in our time. I assume he's thinking of decolonization there. He continues, abruptly there came fulfillment and middle age. The process of self-discovery is over. The English national myth appears complete. But with this, there was loss. A way of looking was weakened. What was English was settled. By this, the world was to be assessed. No longer dynamic and youthful, the idea of England is institutionalized by the mid-century, and in doing so, it loses its vitalism and insight. Thus, in Vanity Fair, Naipaul goes on, Mr. Osborne sees himself as a solid British merchant, but British here is only contrasted with, say, French. Osborne would dearly like to have his son marry Miss Swartz, the West Indian Negro heiress. Mr. Bumble of Oliver Twist and Mr. Squeers of Nicholas Nickleby are English, but that is not their most important feature, Naipaul argues. 20 years later, he says, what different characters begin to appear in Dickens? There is Mr. Podsnap of Our Mutual Friend. He knows foreigners and is proud to be British. John Halifax, the eponymous hero of Dina Craig's novel, is only a gentleman. Ryder Haggard dedicates King Solomon's Mines to his son in hopes that he will become an Englishman and a gentleman. This is all Naipaul. And is with similar hope that Tom Brown, the hero of Thomas Hughes's Bildungsroman, is sent off by his father to Rugby. By naturalizing Englishness in this manner, by giving itself roots and anchoring itself, British fiction, according to Naipaul, and British culture more generally, loses its capacity for humanistic inquiry. He says, in the novel, interest shifts from human behavior to the Englishness of behavior. With no need for further self-discovery, England by the mid-century is a static idea by which to assess and reflect upon the world. In the genre of travel writing, the genre of Naipaul's own text, he says, we can observe a progressive deterioration from Darwin to Trollope to Kingsley to Froude. More and more, these writers were not reporting on themselves, but on their Englishness. And English literature more generally begins to regress. He says, to this dependence on the established and reassuring might be traced the singular omissions of English writing in the last 100 years. And then, like an even bolder claim, no monumental writer succeeded Dickens. Judgments on artistic value aside, Naipaul yokes national culture to the critical capacity of its literature as a contradiction. When the former, national culture, is fully realized, the latter, the critical capacity of its literature, degenerates. The moment of arrival for a nation is also an epoch of stagnancy. All nations are to Naipaul a kind of unimaginative communities. In some ways, for him, the arrival of 19th century nationalism is a spectacle of decline. The second it arrives, it starts losing its critical insight. So the reason this is illuminating for me is like, as is well known, historicism is like a necessary ingredient to national ideology. So Lukács sees European nationalism emerge out of the birth of historicism, where Anderson sees Europe's national imagination to be premised on the meanwhile of national historical time, while Balibar sees the nation formed to rely on narratives of development. Naipaul sees national identity to coincide with historical stasis. His counterintuitive history of Victorian culture and society casts the British nation form, which like all nation forms is premised on historicism, as having ceased to do so in its own heyday. It's a very sort of idiosyncratic account of the rise of nationalism. It is in this sense of a kind of stalled modernity, evident in cultural objects in which people self-consciously express ideas of themselves, that Naipaul observes India's architecture of independence. If Corbusier was commissioned to realize post-colonial India's idea of itself as a modern, rational society, as a society with roots, then he could only do so by creating a building that was, to think back to Naipaul's idea of the Raj, a little too grand for its purpose, too grand for the puniness, poverty, and defeat in which it was set. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser. And last, we will hear from Tariq. Take it away, Tariq.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to the other panelists as well for three fantastic short papers. Thanks also to the organisers of this fantastic symposium for the invitation to participate as well. I'm really excited to be involved, and I'm kind of in awe actually at what you've managed to put together through the course of this week. Looks really fantastic. Before I go on though, I guess I do just want to acknowledge that this is an all-male panel. Sometimes it happens that way, but I think it's incumbent on us to recognise these things when they do happen. Okay, so I'm I'm a human geographer. I work at the intersections of critical geography and post-colonial theory. So amongst other things, I'm very interested in thinking critically and historically about the history of my own discipline, its connections to imperialism as well. And geography, as I'm sure we're all well aware, has a quite murky past, right? It was a science of exploration, discovery, travel. It was replete with the kinds of imperial masculinities and complex forms of racialization that went hand in hand with those pursuits in 18th, 19th and early 20th century Europe. So much of my work, I've been keen to think about the lasting legacies of these things in the present, in terms of the demographics of the discipline today, the syllabus, our theoretical debates, ways we conduct fieldwork, so on and so forth. But as important as all this is, I think what's also important is encouraging what is an increasingly diverse undergraduate student cohort to think about where the discipline in which they are majoring comes from. And remember that in the UK, our undergraduates major from day one of their bachelor degrees. So that's why I want to do something just a little bit different over the next 5-10 minutes, and that is to talk about teaching, actually, specifically by saying a few words on a day-long field visit, I guess you could call it, or rather an in situ lecture and set of workshops that we give our first years in their second week at university on their degree programs in geography at UCL. And we take them to the Royal Geographical Society, the RGS, which is in South Kensington in London, which is just a short tube ride away from UCL. And I'm going to just say a word or two about the RGS before saying a little bit more about what my colleague who I deliver this trip with, Professor Anson Mackay, who's a physical geographer, and I, together with the staff at the RGS, what we try to achieve there with our students, because I think it speaks to some of the themes of this symposium this week. Now, for those who don't know, the RGS with the Institute of British Geographers, they merged in 1995. The Royal Geographical Society is the UK's learned society and professional body for geography who work to advance and support the discipline. They publish 3 of our top-ranked journals in the discipline, and I would say they very much coordinate the discipline at the national scale, also hosting the annual RGS IBG International Conference, which attracts around 2,000 delegates, which is big in the UK context. The society was founded in 1830 with the aim of, and I'm just going to quote the aim as it was spelled out in the original charter. The aim was the promotion and diffusion of that most important and entertaining branch of knowledge, geography. And the society moved into its current premises in South Kensington in 1913. Now, in the lecture at the RGS that we give the students, we use the historical geographer Felix Driver's excellent book, Geography Militant, to narrate a history of the society. And Felix Driver's book uses Conrad's motif of geography militant from his 1924 essay entitled Geography and Some Explorers. And he uses that trope of geography militant to talk about this era when geographical knowledge production was very much hedged on science and exploration, right? So this is the period in which the RGS is formed. And the objective of geographical research during this period was broadly to kind of go, as we know, to heretofore untraveled parts of the world and discover the truth, of course, to this task. And I don't really need to belabor this point for this audience. Am I still with you? I just had a notice saying.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit, so maybe you could take it back like 30 seconds, just so we can get.
So I was saying how we use Felix Driver's book, Geography Militant, to narrate a history of the discipline and the society. And that Felix Driver uses Conrad's motif of geography militant from a 1924 essay of his. And the point really I was trying to make was that in this period, this is the period in which the RGS is formed. And the objective of geographical research in this period was to go to these heretofore untraveled parts of the world and discover the truth about them. And explorer come geographers did this. This is what they did, right? And I think I was just saying that I don't really need to sort of belabor this point for this audience, but what I do want to stress is that the RGS comes to play a key role in the 19th century in the dissemination and the authentication of geographical knowledge, right? It was the place from which real geographers disseminated knowledge that was gathered, of course, on their swashbuckling travels across far-flung corners of the world. And they did so through lectures in the Society's main lecture theatre, transactions published in the Society's journals. And in so doing, then, these were tales that then became authenticated as geographical science, right? And the RGS's location in South Kensington isn't incidental here. It's hugely important because it's a stone's throw away from the Natural History Museum, the V&A, the Science Museum, Imperial College as well, all institutions dedicated to the dissemination of worldly knowledge gathered from around the British Empire and brought back home to the imperial metropolis. So the point being here that the RGS was very much part of the British Empire's information network, just as it is today a central node in the global landscape of geographical knowledge production, right? So those geographies of geographical knowledge production continue, they're still with us, right? So it's in this context that we think that the pedagogic value of telling this history to our students in the very same lecture theatre in which these Victorian era explorers had performed this geography militant, and we think the pedagogic value of doing this is quite profound, actually. We could, of course, tell them about the history of the RGS and their discipline from the comfort of UCL's lecture theatres. And of course, UCL is not without its own dubious historical legacies, of course, but that's another matter. But we want our students to experience the society, right? We want them to smell the polished wood panelling in the Ondaatje lecture theatre, to hear the creak of the Victorian floorboards as they walk through the space, to see the ornamental gilt-edged globes in the Society's grand committee room and feel the piercing gaze of the many dead white male explorers whose oil portraits hang on the Society's walls. Right, we want them to feel that curious mixture of grandeur and discomfort. We want it to be a slightly unhomely experience for them to feel out of place in some senses. And we do so because we want to use these rather awkward and uncomfortable aesthetic registers as openings, right, and invitations for our students to trouble over. Because I think it's really important for them to be uncomfortable with our disciplinary past, actually, right? Such that they might feel the stakes of forging a more comfortable and open future for the discipline that they're now part of. And it's important to add here that we also want our students to hear and feel the ways that the RGS today has welcomed us into, I guess, the heart and soul of their operations, precisely in order for us to be able to tell this history, right? So it's not as if we're doing this kind of under their radar, so to speak. We're invited in to do this, right? It's not something, this history is not something that the society can shy away from. In fact, the RGS actively encourage our students to appropriate the institution and to make it their own, to feel like they can bring their own geographical imaginations and centres of inquiry into a discipline that's trying hard to open, to pluralise, to perform a much wider, more capacious sense of itself going forward, right? And I just want to make, I guess, 2 points, really. I guess I've wanted to talk about this today for a couple of reasons. First, because this is a symposium that addresses, and it's a quote from the symposium blurb, the aesthetics of imperial decline, right? And I think I wanted to emphasize here how important it is for us that our students learn about the decolonial challenges facing geography and geographers through their own spatial experience, through their own feelings of discomfort, right? Now, fieldwork has always, of course, been central to geography. And I guess what we're saying here is that this is a kind of something like a decolonial field experience for our students, or at least that's what we're trying to precipitate, right? But the second and final thing I guess I wanted to say is that what this raises for me is also an important question about decolonial work, which is simply, that we need to think about how the decolonial challenge, how decolonial work articulates with power, right? And how it articulates with powerful institutions in order for meaningful change to precipitate. So it's a question, I guess, for any form of radical politics, actually, and it's one that I think seeks to open a conversation about how and where change might and must take place. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Tariq, and thanks to all of our panelists. I think it might be a good idea as we move into like the roundtable part of the roundtable, if we just all unmute to facilitate, speaking to one another. So I'm gonna start off by posing some general questions, and please, panelists, if you have questions that you would like to pose to the other panelists, please just jump in. And then after a little while, I'll open it up to attendees and their questions. So I guess I was really struck, James, by your conceptualization of the term wasteland and what that is kind of like doing in terms of, it seems like the wasteland is this, the imperial state's way of zoning out authorized areas of non-knowledge or like stupidity. And it seems like there's a lot going on across all of these different papers or different presentations that are in some ways not just articulating empire and knowledge, but really articulating empire and stupidity. So I guess the first question I want to pose to you is how are you conceptualizing, outside of this thing of the wasteland, the relationship between, or are you conceptualizing in any way, the relationship between empire, imperial power, and stupidity, if that's a useful question for you?
So I guess the problem that arises in this sort of thing is that while that so supposedly empty space that makes up the wasteland isn't empty. It has lots of things in it, and the things that it has in it are not easily structured into an economic order that the imperial power would like to create in these places. It's cross-cut with nomads, with unfamiliar animals, strange plants, a whole variety of life that can't easily be incorporated into the imperial process. It also breeds very dangerous things. Brief reference to imperial pests. What I'm looking at are insects, weeds, and invasive species. And I got sidetracked. I've been sidetracked for a year on one of these bugs. I started looking at locusts, and what interested me about locusts is that they come from the wasteland and they migrate into those areas that are full of agricultural abundance and decimate them and then go away, right? And there's not a damn thing that can be done about them. There's no defense against this thing, except in the 20th century, dangerous chemical poisons, which then get incorporated into both the wastelands food chain and the food chains of humans. So I know I'm wandering around the stupid thing, but it seems like the activities that are related to that space, which are consistently being constructed in some scientific basis on how to handle these threats from the outside, continually produce rather dumb responses, rather problematic reactions to it, right? You try to curtail nomadism, for by forcing people to somehow, either through tax systems or through other mechanisms, to become sedentary and become part of the proper order. But they won't, and they don't. they break your rules, and they go off and do other kinds of things, and they become sources of resistance. They become populations ripe for involvement in rebellions and so on. You try to kill all these insects, but you're poisoning at the same time the very thing you're trying to save. Or in the case of the diseases, you try, on the one hand is trying to eliminate malaria, and the other hand is creating places for mosquitoes to breed.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to pick up on this?
I'd say it's not for Naipaul, it's not so much the stupidity of 19th century culture, but like the absurdity. The thing he's constantly calling attention to is the ridiculousness of imagining like dances at the Taj Mahal in the kind of broader political, social context and stuff. So for him, it's not the idiocy of whatever, the Raj and post-colonial nationalism, but the absurdity.
Great, cool, thank you. Peter, anything? No?
Well, I mean, I can just add to that in that, you know, I think it was on one of the slides that I put up on my presentation, but Lessing's got this great take on the political police, especially as she's wandering around in a Black majority colony where she and the only other white person who's trailing her, easy to pick out a mile away. And she says, you know, rather offhandedly, she turns this whole moment of surveillance into farce. She says, you know, the governments should hire mercenaries rather than true believers to do their spying on them, because the true believers, they just want to strangle their subjects, whereas mercenaries might be more cool and take an even-handed approach to things. So Lessing, in an interesting way, isn't at all intimidated by some of the things that she experiences as she wanders around in Rhodesia, being tailed by the political police. She thinks she has all of the tools to outwit them with her pen and her head. So that's one of the ways in which an idea like stupidity plays out in that particular context.
Great, thank you. I mean, the other question I had is, I'm curious if you might speculate. I think it's really actually might be a question for you, Peter, but maybe not. I'm curious about the relationship between data and data of all kinds. It could be like the sense data that Tariq, like the experiential data of hearing floorboards creak as you're walking through an old Victorian room, or the different kinds of like cadastral, like numerical data that James was thinking about, or becoming a police apparatus like inside of your head. I'm curious if you could maybe say a little bit about the relationship between data and knowledge, or data and non-knowledge, because one of the things I was thinking about, Peter, when you were talking about that is, you know, police, security states, empire, it produces a lot of junk data. It produces a lot of data that's not knowledge. And so I'm wondering if maybe we can think about that a little bit. It's, I guess, perhaps a variation of my stupidity question, but I think it's a little bit more precise.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, you've answered the question in the way that I would answer it while posing the question, right? It's, you know, Lessing imagines writers as the ones who can process small amounts of data, but to do so intelligently, whereas states just produce reams and reams and reams of stuff that they don't always understand, and even they don't even have the personnel to manage or look at, you know. So like, as I'm looking through some of the intelligence files on writers like Lessing or CLR James, they're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long with cross-references to all kinds of other files. So that it's this immense machine for gathering information, but there often is no way for the state to process it. It's almost satisfying the need for data without the need for really coming to any sort of useful understanding of that might yield.
Tariq, any thoughts on this?
Well, only to say that I think, I mean, in the context of the Royal Geographical Society's archives, I think there's been quite a discussion about what constitutes data, or what is geographical data. And there's actually Felix Driver, whose book I've referred to, did another subsequent project with the RGS, which is called Hidden Histories of Exploration, in which he was trying to bring into representation the kind of intermediary figures, so Sherpas, pundits, other kinds of guides, etc., that many of these 19th century explorers relied on in order to make their geographical discoveries. And the argument being, of course, that these were some of the real producers of geographical knowledge, and they fall away from the archives, they're forgotten about. So there's an argument there about, or there's a debate there about, what constitutes the data on which we subsequently go on to rely on to produce geographical knowledge. And I think that's something that kind of stays with us, So when I was talking about, and you just mentioned this yourself in the posing of the question, the kind of aesthetic realm that we're trying to get our students to think about, right? That's difficult for them. That's new for them, right? Getting them to think about their own bodies as their own effective realms as a source of data, right? And to trust, their own experience of the place and their own discomfort as something that they can think about. So.
Thank you. Nasser, any thoughts on that, or should I move it along? Move it along. All right. Great. So we have some questions coming in from our attendees. So I think that the procedure is I'm going to call on them and then they'll unmute. Is that what we're doing, Jacob?
Yes, exactly. So we have a question in the Q&A already from Neil Carter, and then I believe Jed asked a question in the DM box.
Okay, great. Neil, can you maybe unmute and pose your question?
I have to go unmute for them 1 minute. It should work now.
Hi, I'll just read it in the interest of trying to maintain clarity. I wrote, I can't help but wonder about something that's implicit in the panelists' remarks thus far, but I'd like for them to draw out further. We haven't yet discussed elements of how forms of imperial knowledge are also patriarchal knowledge that are upheld by people of all genders. I feel like Tariq seemed to address this more than others in terms of attending to geography's history as an imperial knowledge form through figures of explorers, but I'd like to hear other speakers contribute to that point. Thanks.
I'll just jump in. Naipaul is a horrible person to think critically about patriarchy or anything. I'm really, I read that question. I was like, I'm really going to struggle with this because he has, yeah, I need to, so I will sit on that, only to say I will probably not have an answer at the end of everyone's attempt at answering the question.
Peter, James, sorry.
Yeah, I can say really briefly that the spy network that was watching not only Doris Lessing, but a wide range of British writers and intellectuals during this period was overwhelmingly a male spy network that paid very close attention to expressions of sexuality of both men and women, right? Queer men in particular were deemed to be a security risk, and there were plenty of queer intellectuals during this period who were being watched by MI5 and other forms of the political police. Doris Lessing's liaisons with various men are noted in the files, and it's interesting that the British state acted relatively infrequently on this information, but they certainly had a prurient interest in how people expressed their sexuality. It was information they wanted to know, even if they didn't use it.
Great. James or Tariq, any response?
Well, if we're talking about knowledge production, it's men all the way down.
In terms of like the state operators.
Yeah. I think that the tension, if there's a tension, it's between their interaction with Native men around issues of what constitutes appropriate knowledge. And I'm thinking specifically here about the controversies about native medicine, various kinds of medicine, veterinary medicine in particular. What and how do we evaluate this kind of not quite rational thinking? But I mean, it's patriarchal, it's paternalistic, it's male dominated, and it's a world made for men to either succeed or fail in.
Tariq?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I can say here, but I'll try to keep it brief. But I think, I mean, geography is a discipline in which, and I alluded to this in what I said, that there's a long history of imperial masculinities that become imbricated with the forms of knowledge production that our discipline was kind of built upon, right? And I think, it's not unfair to say that some of those patterns remain in the discipline, right? So, one of the points of this, the field visit that I spoke about, was to try to, as I said, is to try to kind of create a sense of opening in the context of what students feel that they might do in the discipline as they go forward. And the RGS as well is, I mean, geography is still a discipline in which, we're split between physical scientists and social scientists or humanities scholars, right? So we work together, but we straddle the physical sciences and the social sciences, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So we still have that, those masculinities still abound, I guess, in some senses. But the RGS is also well aware of this as well. And I mentioned in what I said the numerous oil portraits of the many white male explorers in society's history that adorn the walls. The former president, the president who retired about 2-3 years ago, was a woman, Rita Gardner, and the Society commissioned a great portrait of her, which is hung right in the lobby of the new entrance. So the first thing you see when you go into the RGS is this very modern portrait of the former president, Rita Gardner, right? So there's a conscious kind of attempt to try and, re-aestheticize the place, if that's, or to re-signify the place and thus the discipline, if that's the right term.
Okay, thank you. Now we're gonna. Oh, yeah, please go.
I actually have an answer now, other than my cop-out answer that I gave earlier, which is that something that he turns to repeatedly in that travelogue is a species of an idea of oneself that troubles him, is this kind of big national sort of spectacle, but it is also scenes of domesticity. So when he first arrives in Delhi, he is taken to like a bougie home where he's a paying guest. And he described it as the colony, which is newly built, concrete, modern, as an abrupt huddle of fantasy amidst this kind of like sort of third world scene. And the concrete's still fresh, and the owner, Mrs. Mahindra, has like new fans, like new like taps and faucets, etc. And she's obsessed with modern. All I like is modern. And he quotes that many times. That scene is contrasted to, or actually is akin to, where his travelogue ends, which is, he's come to India. He's in his career, he's like now like identifying in some ways as an English writer. He comes to India, has this whole experience, goes back to London and is immediately horrified by scenes of domesticity in mass culture. So the book concludes with walking in London, seeing ads for like, mid-century like kitchens and things. And he's equally horrified at where he is. So there's a way in which the idea of oneself in domestic scenes is especially like troubling for him, in addition to the kind of more general national statist spectacles that are otherwise visible.
Great.
That's all I've got.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so Jed, do you want to pipe in? I think Jed has a question for you, Nasser.
I will, although Chris, I didn't mean to short circuit the series of questions you were asking, or indeed this conversation about gender and data and knowledge. If there are other questions queued up that are more apposite, I'll pause.
No, I think you can take it away.
Okay. All right. I just was trying to park the question in the queue for Nasser because I can't tell if I'm asking you, Nasser, to further decode Naipaul or kind of meditate on your own interest in this piece of Naipaul writing. But I mean, as we move from that kind of misplaced architectural idea in Chandigarh into the kind of literary history that Naipaul's offering, it's weird, right? There's like the idea that Le Corbusier has an idea of himself as the kind of grandiosity problem or the misplaced idea problem. Then there's an idea of a national culture. And I'm trying, on the one hand, to kind of see where you think Naipaul is talking really about national ego as opposed to some other kind of artistic ego. I mean, that's one root of the question that I'm asking you. And then the other is sort of whether what you think Naipaul is talking about is a generic problem of national particularism leading to a kind of cultural stasis, or a specifically English or post-imperial problem, which is to say, you go through a phase of history where there's bristling production and curiosity, and it may be imperial imposition on all kinds of other less powerful states and societies, but it's got a kind of vitality that Naipaul admires, or whether this critique of the stasis of English culture at a certain point applies to pretty much any culture, previously imperial or not previously imperial, colonized or not colonized, etc.
Yeah, I think the second part, I understand the question better, and my response, I think it is the case that it is not all empires. It is specifically tied to a kind of encounter with modernity. I think he gives examples of other buildings in Germany and thinking that would be absurd to think of that building in this way. So I think for him, it's linked to a particular imperial history. There's also a completely derivative discourse in Chatterjee's sense that India inherits this sort of stasis and reproduces it. He says this in these kinds of horribly judgy statements about the Indian novel, and I think that is tied to a real resistance that he has to national culture, just this kind of relentless, mean a resistance to anything national. So I would say, I mean, in the textual version of your question, my initial sense is it's not coming from him aspiring to a kind of universalism or saying a certain kind that Corbusier needs to get it right. I think it's actually coming from like a place of exile. One that he's encountering maybe a bit more viscerally in the early 60s, when he's seeing London also not as a place of arrival, but as also a space of alienation. I think something that he really sort of articulates more extensively in Mimic Men, which is like 3-4 years after this. That I don't know if that gets at it, but the first part I'm not sure about about that first part of the question.
Clarify maybe a little bit, Jed?
Still there.
Yeah, of course, I remuted myself, but yes, go ahead, Chris. And yes, it did, Nasser, get at exactly what I was asking.
So I was just asking if you could clarify the first part of your question, so Nasser can get at it. Well,
no, I think, I mean, I was just trying to think about, that part wasn't really part of the question. It was just a way of explaining why I was curious about Le Corbusier as a kind of modernist ego trying to reproduce modernity, as opposed to the problem with all these English folks that in the literary history who are trying to reproduce Englishness. It seems like two rather differently scaled problems that Naipaul has.
Yeah, he doesn't name Corbusier. He just says Chandigarh, and he talks about that. He talks about the Amritsar Jallianwala Bagh monument, which is by Benjamin Polk. So so yeah, I was inserting Corbusier there, but I think he's generally referring to kind of, he's seeing modern architecture and is trying to make sense of its sort of relation to post-coloniality.
Thank you, Nasser. So we have another question from Charlotte. Charlotte, can you unmute?
Sure, can you hear me? Okay, I had a question for Tariq, if that's okay, but I think it does touch upon, I think it's something that we can all perhaps think about. Let me pull it up on my own and what I wrote. So this is just perhaps more of an invitation to speak more about uncomfortable experiences in cultural places and spaces. So as museums and cultural spaces actually start to reckon with and publicly admit, quote, uncomfortable histories, and I'm thinking here specifically about this past summer's National Trust slavery report, I'm curious to see how this will translate both with programming, but more importantly, with curatorial practices and decisions. So you talk about feelings of discomfort in the space of the RGS, but how is that achieved? And is it replicable? And I feel odd saying replicable because it's like an odd choice. Affect replicability is perhaps impossible or not quite right. So how do we as practitioners move forward in a way that's appropriate and creative and yeah, just kind of welcome sort of more practical, still critical responses as it relates to that?
Should I go ahead? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for that. It's a really interesting question because I guess, you know, first thing to say is remember, I'm not talking about curatorial practice here. I guess I'm talking about pedagogic practice, right? So, you know, to that extent, I think, and maybe there was a bit of a simplification of the, you know, the registers of affect that kind of emerge each year when we do this, right? It's more complicated, it's more nuanced, and I think the point is to sort of ask the students how they feel in this space, and then to go from there. I think a broader point maybe I would want to make though is that a lot of this work, well, I mean, work geared towards decolonizing the academy in various ways, shapes and forms is not comfortable, right? And we have to probably recognize that and embrace that actually, and kind of move forward with it in the knowledge that it's not comfortable, and that, you know, some of those uncomfortable conversations need to be had, and that, you know, that's difficult for many reasons, not the least because I think, you know, we're also, higher education these days, both in the UK and North America, is so market orientated, right? That, you know, you know, there is a kind of, I worry sometimes that there is a sort of, you know, how do you reconcile market logic with the imperative to bring people into this uncomfortable space, right? And that I don't really have a sort of sophisticated way of forming that question, but I think that's a problem, that's a tension. As to the kind of the affect replicability part of what you said, I think maybe this is one that to kind of get the other panelists' opinions on, because my sense is that artists and writers try to do this, right? That's kind of what good art does in some senses, right? That it can pull you into a problem space, and it can trouble you, right? I mean, I feel uncomfortable every time I read Fanon's The Fact of Blackness, for example, right? You know, so there are certain kinds of modes and registers that can do that, I think, but I'd be interested to hear what other people might have to say.
Yeah, James, Nasser, any thoughts on this? No? All right, so we have another question that is kind of oriented toward the active. Tariq, could you unmute and pose it?
Yes, can you hear me? Let me begin by acknowledging, and it's an humble acknowledgement, that I am kind of disappointed with this panel, because I feel that I wanted the panelists and members of this roundtable to engage a little bit more with the kind of text, with the kind of data that they have engaged with. I did see Professor Jazeel engaged with it in the previous question, but not so much in the presentation themselves. So I want the participants of this roundtable to reflect a bit more on the kind of relationship that they have with their text. But my specific question is for Professor Kalliney. What kind of scholarly relationship would you have with such forms of archival data that has its foundation in a form of carceral logic and surveillance? But so my question is not so much about the contents of the file, which you have brilliantly elucidated. What is your sort of relationship with these files?
I'd be happy to jump in, but I was wondering if you could just add to your question a little bit. And when you asked me to characterize my relationship, it's a very broad question. And I wonder if you have something more specific in mind. I mean, I can answer it if that's all you have to say, but if you have more that you're asking me about, it would help me if you could be more explicit.
Right, sure. So there was a section where you pointed out how so many of the writers were under surveillance, and there have been files which were constantly referencing them. So my question is probably in reference to those parts where the writers are being constantly surveilled by the empire. Thank you.
Well, I talk very explicitly in the expanded version of this, which is going to be a chapter in a book, about the experience of being surveilled by the state. I mean, it's important to acknowledge how damaging this can be to the people who are under surveillance. In a different chapter, I have a whole long discussion about writers who were incarcerated by the state. So I talk about Vole Soyinka and Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ruth First and some of the things that they do with their prison memoirs. When you ask me about my relationship with these materials, I mean, I think my primary responsibility is to get to the best understanding that I possibly can about how these writers responded to the various forms of state intimidation to which they were put by the political police. In Doris Lessing's career, it's very interesting, not only in the novel that I talked about, Four Gated City, but in The Golden Notebook. If those of you out there who know that novel, you'll remember that one of the main characters, Tommy, tries to commit suicide. And he does so after a lengthy interrogation scene with the main character, Anna. And so I think, when I'm looking at these files that are collected by agents of the state, my main thought is always, how does it affect the individuals who are being surveilled, whose lives are material for the state, and what consequence did it have on their forms of intellectual work during this period? I may be a little bit too celebratory at times, because I say that the state didn't have things all their own way, right? Various writers who were deported, censored, watched, jailed, were able, in some cases, to tell their own side of that story. And it's my responsibility to that I think I feel most greatly when I'm looking at files. Tariq, I hope that begins to answer your question.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I see, Jacob, we're supposed to be cutting it off at about now, right?
That's right.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a really great question to kind of end on, and hopefully through the panels in the coming days, we'll be able to think more about the affect life of knowledge and affect as a kind of instrument of knowledge. But for the moment, I just wanted to thank our panelists for their stimulating presentations and discussion. So thank you. It was wonderful. And yeah, Jacob, do you have any announcements so I can stop talking?
No, that would be all. Thank you so much, everybody, and for all of the audience members who asked questions. It's been a great event, and it feels like things are off to a good start after a tech blunder this morning. So thank you all once again, and look out for an email once again with information for panel 1B for tomorrow morning.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.